The Great Hall of the Galactic Concordium was built to make small beings feel smaller. Its walls rose so high that clouds sometimes formed near the ceiling. Its floor was made of black stone, taken from a dead star. Every species that entered felt the weight of that place before they said a single word. Ambassador Tuven of the Veltar people did not feel the weight of stone. He felt the weight of dying children. He stood before the council in a borrowed robe, because his own robes had burned along with his home city. Behind him stood 2 more Veltar, all that remained of his delegation. The others had stayed behind, on a world called Ravash, where something the humans would later name the Marrow Swarm was eating its way through the last farmland his people had left. "Honored Council," Tuven said, and his voice did not shake, though his hands did. 3 of our outer colonies are gone, not damaged, not captured, gone. Every living thing on those worlds has been consumed and turned into more of the swarm. We have perhaps 4 months before it reaches our homeworld. We are asking, we are begging, for ships, for weapons, for anything. The council chamber was full of tall chairs, and in those chairs sat the great powers of the galaxy. The Threll Ascendancy, whose fleets could darken a sky. The Ophidian Curia, whose priests spoke of fate as if it were a science. The Marn Combine, whose banks controlled half the trade lanes. And a dozen smaller powers who mostly nodded along with whoever spoke first. A Threll admiral rose. His skin was the color of old copper, and he wore his medals the way other people wore threats. "The Ascendancy has reviewed the Veltar petition," he said. "Our analysts calculate that saving 3 border colonies and 1 homeworld would cost more warships than the entire Veltar economy is worth, even projected across 200 years. The math does not favor intervention." "The math," Tuven repeated quietly, "does not include the number of people who will die." "The math includes everything relevant," the admiral said, and sat back down. Next came a priest of the Ophidian Curia, robed in silver scales that caught the light of the chamber's high windows. Her voice was soft, almost kind, which somehow made her words worse. "The great pattern prunes what cannot grow strong enough," she said. "We have watched species fall before. Grief is natural. Interference in the pattern is not. We wish the Veltar peace in their final season." A murmur ran through the chamber. Not disagreement. Agreement, dressed up as sympathy. The Marn Combine representative did not even bother standing. He simply activated a small floating screen that showed columns of numbers, projected losses, projected gains, projected nothing that had anything to do with a dying planet. "The Combine finds no profitable path to assistance," he said. "We recommend the Veltar seek private contractors, if any can be found who are foolish enough to take the risk." One by one, delegate after delegate rose, and one by one, they found reasons to do nothing. Some blamed cost, some blamed fate, some simply said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. Tuven listened to all of it, and somewhere in the 3rd hour of listening, something inside him went very quiet and very cold. He had come to this hall believing that a request made honestly, by a species in true danger, could not be refused by people who called themselves civilized. He was wrong. Civilization, he was learning, could refuse anything, as long as it did the refusing politely. When the council finally called for a vote on whether to send even a single relief convoy, the result came back unanimous. No. Filed as non-interference. Category 3. Low strategic value. Tuven was escorted out of the Great Hall by a young Concordium clerk, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I am sorry, Ambassador," the clerk said, in the hallway outside. "I know that is not enough, but I am sorry." "Sorry does not stop the swarm," Tuven said. "No," the clerk agreed. He hesitated, glancing both ways down the long corridor, as if checking for someone who might report him for saying too much. "There is one delegation you have not spoken to. New to the Concordium. Most people do not take them seriously yet." "Who?" "Humans. From a system called Sol. They only joined the wider community a little over 10 years ago. They do not have much of a fleet by Threll standards. But," the clerk paused, choosing his words, "they have a reputation for saying yes to strange requests. And for not calculating the way the others calculate." Tuven almost laughed, the sound coming out broken and tired. "The primitives. I have heard of them. Their own worlds barely survived their own wars, from what I am told. That may be exactly why, the clerk said, and left it there. Tuven had nothing left to lose. He had already been refused by the greatest powers in the galaxy. What was one more refusal, from a species too young and too small to matter? He found the human delegation 2 levels down, in a room far smaller and plainer than the great hall above. There was no black stone floor here, no chairs built to make visitors feel small, just a long table, some chairs that did not match each other, and 3 humans in plain gray uniforms, none of whom looked like they belonged in a palace of politics. One of them, a woman with short dark hair and tired eyes, looked up as Tuven entered. She did not stand on ceremony. She did not recite titles. She simply asked, "You're the Veltar ambassador, the one the council just turned down." "Word travels fast," Tuven said. "Word travels fast when everyone up there is proud of what they just did," she said, and there was no warmth in the way she said it. "I'm Special Envoy Naomi Cho. This is Fleet Liaison Officer Marcus Webb, and Dr. Elias Grant, our xenobiology attaché. What do you need, Ambassador? And please, skip the part where you apologize for asking." Tuven found himself, for the first time in 3 hours, being looked at as if he were a person and not a line item in a budget. He told them everything. The 3 lost colonies. The Marrow Swarm's strange growth, doubling in size every time it consumed a world, learning something each time it fed. The 4 months until it reached Ravash's capital. The children who had already died. He did not soften any of it, because he no longer believed softening the truth earned anyone's help. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Naomi Cho asked the only question that mattered. "How many ships do you need, and how fast can we load them?" Tuven stared at her. "You have not asked what it will cost you. You have not asked whether it is profitable. You have not asked what the Concordium will think of Earth for defying their non-interference ruling." "We heard the Concordium's answer already," Marcus Webb said, arms crossed, voice flat. "We don't need to ask them what they think twice." "But your fleet," Tuven said, "forgive me, but by galactic standards it is small, untested. The Marrow Swarm has already destroyed warships far larger than anything humanity has built." Dr. Grant, quiet until now, leaned forward. "Ambassador, can I ask you something? When the Swarm took your first colony, how many ships did the Concordium send to help evacuate civilians?" "None," Tuven said. "We were told evacuation support fell outside the interference doctrine." "And the second colony?" "None." "The third?" Tuven said nothing. He did not need to. "That's the difference," Dr. Grant said quietly. "They send calculations. We're not going to send you a calculation, Ambassador. We're going to send you people." Naomi Cho was already keying something into a compact device on the table, her fingers moving fast. "I'm putting in a formal request to Earth Fleet Command tonight. I'll need everything you have on the Swarm's behavior, its speed, its numbers, and your homeworld's defenses. We are not the biggest fleet in this galaxy, Ambassador, but we've buried enough of our own people to know what it looks like when someone asks for help and nobody comes." For the first time since the Marrow Swarm had appeared in Veltar space, Tuven allowed himself, carefully, to hope. "Why?" he asked, unable to stop himself. "You do not know us. We have nothing to offer humanity in return. Why would you risk your people for strangers?" Naomi Cho looked up from her device, and for a moment, her tired eyes were not tired at all. "Because somebody has to be the ones who answer," she said. "And apparently, tonight, that's us." Outside the small room, the great hall of the Concordium continued its business, unaware that in a plain room 2 levels below, a decision had just been made that would change how the entire galaxy saw the newest, smallest, and most stubborn species it had ever met. Later that night, Tuven sat alone in the small guest quarters the humans had given him aboard their embassy ship, turning the day's events over in his mind. He thought of the Threll Admiral's calm, confident math, the priest's soft talk of patterns and fate, the Combine's cold indifference dressed up as business sense. He had expected, walking into that grand chamber, that the galaxy's oldest and strongest powers would at least argue with each other about how much help to send. He had not expected them to agree so quickly, and so completely, that no help was needed at all. He thought too about the small room 2 floors below, the mismatched chairs, the plain gray uniforms, and a woman, who had not once asked what saving his people would cost. He did not understand humans yet. He barely understood their history, their culture, or why a species so young to the wider galaxy would risk itself for strangers. But he understood, in a simple and immediate way, that something in that small room had felt more honest than anything in the grand chamber above it. He drafted a short message to send home to what remained of his government, knowing the signal would take hours to reach Ravash, even at its fastest speed. He kept the words simple, because his people had grown tired of hope dressed up in complicated language. "The Concordium has refused us," he wrote, "but there is a new species called humanity. They have agreed to send help. I do not know yet if it will be enough, but it is more than anyone else offered, and I believe, for the first time since this crisis began, that we are not entirely alone." He sent the message, then sat by the small viewport of his quarters, watching the unfamiliar stars of human space drift by, and allowed himself, cautiously, to imagine a version of the future where his homeworld still existed a year from now. Word of the human decision reached Earth Fleet Command before Ambassador Tuven had even finished packing his few belongings for the journey home. Naomi Cho's request did not sit on a desk for weeks the way Concordium requests did. It moved. At Earth Fleet Command, deep beneath the old city of Geneva, Fleet Admiral Sarah Okafor read the report twice, then called a meeting for that same evening. She did not need 3 months of study. She had grown up in a world still rebuilding from its own near collapse, back when humanity had almost destroyed itself with its own wars and its own mistakes. She knew what it looked like when help came too late, and she knew what it looked like when it came at all. "A species called the Veltar," she said to the officers gathered around the table. "Agrarian people. Small fleet, mostly for local defense, nothing built for war. They're being consumed by something called the Marrow Swarm, a hive organism that grows smarter every time it kills something. 3 colonies already gone, 4 months until their homeworld falls." "And the Concordium refused them," said one officer, not really asking. "Unanimously," Okafor said. "Every major power in that chamber said no, too costly, against fate, not profitable enough." A younger officer near the back of the room, Commander Alex Reyes, spoke without waiting to be called on, a habit that had gotten him both promoted and reprimanded in equal measure over the years. "So it falls to us," he said. "It doesn't fall to anyone, Commander," Okafor said. "Nobody is forcing Earth to do this. We are choosing to." "With respect, ma'am, I don't see much difference," Reyes said. "If we don't go, nobody does. That sounds like it falls to us." Okafor allowed herself something close to a smile. She had known Reyes for 11 years, since he was young officer commanding a rescue cutter during the Pacific Reclamation, when he had once disobeyed a direct order to save a fishing village nobody with any authority thought was worth the fuel cost. He had been right that day, and he had been right more times since than he had been wrong, which was the only reason he still had a command. "I want a relief fleet assembled within 72 hours, Okafor said to the room. "Not our best ships. Not our newest ships, our toughest ships. Whatever we send, it needs to survive contact with something that has already destroyed 3 inhabited worlds and learned from every fight it has won. Commander Reyes, you have field experience against unknown hostiles. You will lead it." "Yes, ma'am." "You should know," Okafor added, quieter now, "that if this goes badly, Earth will take the blame for interfering, where the Concordium's own experts said not to. There will be no rescue fleet coming for you, Commander. If the swarm proves too much, you and your people are on your own out there." Reyes thought of his sister, who had died during the reclamation years, in a flood nobody had been sent to prevent, because the cost analysis said the town wasn't worth saving. He thought of the years afterward, growing up in a country that had rebuilt itself brick by brick, because enough people had refused to accept that "it isn't worth the cost" was a good enough reason to let people die. "Understood, ma'am," he said. "We'll manage." Meanwhile, far above Earth's atmosphere, word of the mission spread through the fleet faster than any official announcement could travel. Pilots who had transferred out of combat postings years ago requested transfers back in. Engineers volunteered overtime without being asked. A supply officer named Priya Iyer, who had never seen combat in her life, walked into Reyes's office and asked to be assigned to the relief convoy's logistics team. "You know this isn't a training exercise," Reyes told her. "This is real. People could die out there. You could die out there. I know, sir, Ayer said. My grandmother used to tell me a story about a village that flooded, because the government said helping wasn't worth the budget. She always said the worst thing in the world wasn't the flood. It was watching people decide you weren't worth saving. I'd rather be one of the people who decides different. Reyes looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once and signed her transfer papers. Back in the Concordium's Great Hall, news of the human decision arrived like a bad smell nobody wanted to admit noticing. The Threll admiral who had calculated the Veltar not worth saving heard about it from an aide and actually laughed out loud. They're sending ships, he said, amused. The primitives are sending actual warships to fight the Marrow Swarm. Do they even know what that thing does to fleets larger than theirs? Apparently they do not care, the aide said. Then they will learn, the admiral said, and went back to his reports, already certain of how the story would end. The Ophidian priest, who had spoken of the great pattern pruning the weak, received the news differently. She sat alone in her chambers for a long while afterward, turning the report over in her long fingers, saying nothing to anyone. If a species so young, so unproven, so recently arrived among the stars, was willing to bleed for people who owed them nothing, then perhaps the pattern she served was not as clean or as certain as she had always claimed. She told no one this thought. She simply filed the report away and did not mention the humans again for a very long time. Ambassador Tuven, meanwhile, traveled home aboard the fastest ship the humans could spare, accompanied by Naomi Cho and Dr. Grant, both of whom had insisted on coming in person rather than sending the fleet ahead alone. Your council will be furious with you, Tuven said to Naomi, somewhere in the long quiet of the journey. You have gone around their ruling. We didn't go around anything, Naomi said. The Concordium voted not to send Concordium ships. They never voted on what Earth does with its own fleet. There's a difference, and it's a difference we intend to use every time this happens again. Again, Tuven repeated. You think this will happen again? Naomi's expression turned grim in the low light of the ship's cabin. Ambassador, in the time it took your council to vote no, 7 more distress signals came in from other systems. Different species, same story. Someone or something moving through the outer rim, and a Concordium too comfortable to bother responding. This won't be the last time somebody comes looking for a door that will actually open. Tuven absorbed this in silence. He had come to the Concordium believing his people's crisis was uniquely tragic, a singular horror visited upon a small and blameless world. He was only now beginning to understand that the galaxy was full of small, blameless worlds, and that the great powers had built an entire system designed to look away from every one of them at once. Then I suppose, he said finally, the Veltar are fortunate that the humans arrived when they did, and not some later, more convenient year. Luck had nothing to do with it, Dr. Grant said from across the cabin, not looking up from the datapad, where he was already studying everything the Veltar had recorded about the Marrow Swarm's growth patterns. You asked. We were the only ones in that hall who still remembered how to say yes. The ship pressed on toward Veltar space, carrying with it the first human relief convoy the galaxy had ever seen. While behind them, in the great hall of the Concordium, the powers of the galaxy went back to their calculations, confident that whatever the humans were about to attempt, it would end in a lesson about the limits of good intentions. They would be wrong, though none of them knew it yet. Not everyone in the Concordium's great hall reacted with dismissal or discomfort. In the public gallery, where representatives of smaller, non-voting species were permitted to observe but not speak, a young recorder from a species called the Kessa, whose own homeworld had been quietly refused Concordium aid 2 generations earlier during a resource shortage, watched the reaction to the human decision with something close to disbelief. She had grown up hearing stories of that refusal from her grandparents, stories that always ended the same way. Nobody came, and her people had rebuilt alone, slower and poorer than they might have been otherwise. She filed an unofficial report that evening, one that would never be read by any delegate with real power, but that found its way, through quiet channels, to other recorders and observers from other overlooked species. It contained only a few lines. The humans said yes without asking what it would cost. I do not know if they will succeed, but for the first time since I began this work, I saw a great power's decision that was not about profit or fear. I do not know what to make of that yet, but I believe it matters. Aboard the ship carrying Tuven, Naomi, and Dr. Grant back toward Veltar space, the mood remained tense, despite the decision already made. Naomi spent long hours coordinating logistics with Earth Fleet Command, adjusting resupply routes, and confirming medical support would be ready at the first available human outpost near Veltar territory. Dr. Grant buried himself in the data Tuven had provided, running early models of the Marrow Swarm's growth and behavior, searching for any pattern that might give the coming relief fleet an advantage before they even arrived. "It doesn't behave like anything in our own records," Grant admitted to Naomi one evening, rubbing his eyes after hours staring at incomplete data. "Every predator we've ever studied has limits, patterns it doesn't deviate from. This thing seems to be rewriting its own patterns as it goes." "Then we'll have to do the same," Naomi said. "We didn't get this far as a species by only doing things one way." Tuven, listening from across the cabin, found himself, for the first time in weeks, beginning to believe that his people's story might not end the way the Concordium had quietly assumed it would. Naomi noticed the change in him almost immediately. "You look less like a man carrying a funeral," she said. "I am not yet ready to celebrate," Tuven said, "but I find myself, against my better judgment, willing to hope again." "Good," Naomi said. "Hold on to that. We're going to need it before this is over." The human relief fleet gathered in Earth orbit over the course of 3 days, and even the officers who had helped design the ships felt a small twist of doubt looking at the assembled convoy from a distance. 12 vessels. Not the sleek, elegant shapes favored by Threll shipwrights, nor the crystalline hulls of the Ophidian war barges. Human ships looked like what they were, tools built by people who expected to take a beating and needed to keep working anyway. Thick armor plating bolted in overlapping layers. Weapon mounts that could be repaired with parts from 3 different manufacturers. Engines built for reliability instead of elegance. Commander Alex Reyes stood on the observation deck of the flagship, a heavy cruiser called the Resolute, and watched the convoy assemble around him. Beside him stood Dr. Elias Grant, who had rejoined the fleet after returning from Veltar space with fresh data, and Naomi Cho, who had insisted on staying aboard as the mission's civilian envoy, despite Reyes's objections. "You don't have to be here for the fighting part," Reyes told her, "not for the first time." "I didn't come this far to hand off the hard part to someone else," Naomi said. "Besides, somebody has to be able to talk to the Veltar when we get there. You're good at shooting things, Commander. I'm good at everything that happens after." Reyes almost smiled. "Fair enough." Dr. Grant had spent the last 2 days going over every scrap of information the Veltar had recorded about the Marrow Swarm, and what he found troubled him more each time he reviewed it. "This isn't a normal hostile species," he told Reyes and Naomi during their final briefing before departure. "It doesn't behave like an animal, and it doesn't behave like a machine. Every time it destroys a population, it seems to absorb something. Biological data, tactical patterns. The Veltar recorded early swarm attacks as slow, almost clumsy. By the 3rd colony, the same creatures were adapting to Veltar weapon frequencies within hours." "So it learns," Reyes said. "It learns fast," Grant said, "which means whatever tactics work on the first day might not work on the 5th. We need to hit it hard, and hit it in ways it hasn't seen yet, every single time." "Understood," Reyes said. He turned to address the assembled bridge crew, and beyond them, through the ship's internal broadcast, every soul aboard the 12 vessels of the relief convoy. "Listen up. Where we're going, nobody else was willing to go. That means there's no cavalry coming behind us if this goes wrong. It also means every single person on this convoy volunteered to be here, knowing that. I am not going to stand up here and tell you this will be easy. I'm going to tell you the truth. It will probably be the hardest thing most of us have ever done. But somewhere out past that jump point, there's a planet full of people who have already been told no by everyone bigger and stronger than us. We are not telling them no. Prep for departure." The convoy jumped out of Earth orbit within the hour. Word of the mission reached the Concordium almost immediately, carried by observation drones that tracked traffic through the major jump lanes. Within the Great Hall, delegates who had voted against helping the Veltar now found themselves discussing, with a strange mixture of curiosity and disdain, what the humans thought they were doing. 12 ships, the Threll Admiral said, reviewing the intercepted convoy manifest, with something between amusement and disbelief. 12 small, poorly designed ships against a swarm capable of consuming an entire colony in under a week. This is not bravery, this is theater. They wish to be seen trying, so that when they inevitably fail, they can claim they tried harder than we did. Perhaps, said the aide standing beside him, though he did not sound entirely convinced. Elsewhere in the Concordium, a handful of lesser delegates, representatives of smaller species, who had themselves once been refused help by the greater powers, watched the human convoy's departure with a very different kind of attention. Among them was a delegate from a modest trading species called the Ithril, whose homeworld had survived a resource blockade 20 years earlier, only because a wandering group of independent traders had broken Concordium sanctions to bring food through. The Ithril delegate said nothing publicly, but he made a note in his private records. Watch what the humans do next. Aboard the Resolute, the journey to Veltar space took the better part of 4 days, even at the convoy's best jump speed. Reyes used the time to run drills, testing coordination between all 12 ships against simulated swarm attack patterns built from the Veltar's own combat recordings. The simulations did not go well. "We're losing 3 ships out of 12 in every version of this scenario," said Lieutenant Priya Iyer, the young logistics officer who had transferred onto the mission and quickly proven herself sharp enough to be pulled into tactical planning as well. "The swarm adapts to our weapon patterns faster than our systems can adjust fire solutions." "Then we stop relying only on our systems," Reyes said, studying the simulation replay. "Dr. Grant, you said the swarm learns from what it survives. What if we give it less to learn from? Randomize firing patterns manually, instead of through targeting computers. Mix conventional weapons with improvised tactics it hasn't cataloged yet." "That's going to cost us accuracy," Iyer said. "Probably," Reyes agreed, "but it might cost the swarm its advantage. I'd rather hit soft than hit predictable." Grant nodded slowly, turning the idea over. "There's something else worth trying. The Veltar records show the swarm avoids certain frequencies of tight beam radiation, not because it's harmful, but because it seems to interfere with whatever internal signal the hive uses to coordinate itself. If we can identify that signal precisely, we might be able to disrupt swarm coordination during an engagement, even briefly." "How long would that take to develop?" Reyes asked. "With Veltar sensor logs and our own equipment," Grant said. "Maybe 2 days, if I don't sleep." "Then don't sleep," Reyes said, not unkindly. "We don't have anything to spare." By the time the convoy reached the outer edge of Veltar space, Grant had a rough prototype of a signal disruptor, built from spare parts and stubbornness, untested against a real swarm, but ready to try. Naomi Cho spent the same 2 days in contact with Ambassador Tuven's government, coordinating evacuation routes for civilians still in the swarm's projected path and preparing shelters closer to the capital. "They still don't quite believe you're coming," Tuven told her over a long-range channel, his voice tired, but no longer as hollow as it had been in the Concordium's Great Hall. "My people have learned not to believe promises from off-world." "Then let them believe what they see instead of what we say," Naomi said. "We'll be there soon, Ambassador. Tell them to hold on a little longer." As the convoy crossed the final jump point into Veltar space, Reyes stood once more on the Resolute's bridge, watching the system's star grow larger on the main display, along with the first faint sensor traces of something moving through the outer colonies that was neither a planet, nor a ship, nor anything the Veltar's own instruments had ever fully understood. "Contact confirmed," the sensor officer said quietly. "Marrow Swarm formations detected in orbit around Veltar Colony 7. Estimated swarm mass has grown since last Veltar report." Reyes felt the old, familiar tightening in his chest that came before every fight he had ever known mattered. "All ships," he said, keying the fleet-wide channel. "This is Commander Reyes. We are not here to calculate whether these people are worth saving. That question was already answered the moment we said yes. Weapons hot, prepare for engagement." Behind him, on the long-range display, the swirling mass of the Marrow Swarm turned, almost as if it had noticed something new arriving in its territory for the very first time. Below decks, in the cramped medical bay of the Resolute, a young medic named Corporal Daniel Osei checked and rechecked supplies he hoped he would not need to use. He had joined the fleet only 8 months earlier, straight out of training, and had never expected his first deployment to be a mission the Concordium itself had refused to authorize. "You scared?" asked the medic working beside him, an older woman named Chief Petty Officer Marisol Vega, who had served through 2 previous conflicts and had the calm, worn manner of someone who had learned long ago how to carry fear without letting it show. "A little," Osei admitted. "Mostly I keep thinking about the numbers. 400 swarm units against 11 Veltar ships, and we're bringing 12 more. That's not exactly good odds." "Odds aren't the only thing that decides a fight," Vega said, checking a tray of surgical tools with practiced hands. "I've seen good odds lose plenty of times, and I've seen bad odds win, when the people fighting believed hard enough in why they were fighting. Doesn't mean we win this one, just means the numbers aren't the whole story." "My grandfather used to say something like that," Osei said, "about the reclamation." He said the towns that survived weren't always the ones with the best odds. They were the ones where people refused to give up on each other. "Sounds like a smart man," Vega said. "He didn't survive it," Osei said quietly. "But the stories did." Vega set down the tray and looked at him for a long moment. "Then let's make sure this story has a good ending too." Elsewhere on the ship, Lieutenant Ayer ran final checks on the tactical systems, cross-referencing Grant's early swarm behavior models against the ship's targeting computers, adjusting parameters by hand wherever the automated systems seemed too predictable. She had never expected, when she requested transfer to the logistics division only weeks earlier, to find herself helping plan tactics for a battle against a creature no human had ever fought before. But she found, working through the calculations late into the ship's artificial night, that she did not regret the choice at all. By the time the convoy reached the final jump point into Veltar space, every soul aboard the 12 human ships understood, in their own way, exactly what they had volunteered for, and exactly why it mattered. Before the guns fired, there was a moment of quiet on the Resolute's bridge, the kind of quiet that only exists in the last seconds, before something irreversible begins. Commander Alex Reyes used that moment the way he always did, thinking not of the battle ahead, but of the reasons that had brought him there. He had been 11 years old during the worst of the Pacific Reclamation, when rising water had swallowed whole coastlines, and half the world's governments had spent more time arguing over cost than sending help. His hometown had not been rich enough or strategic enough to matter to the people making those calculations. His sister had been on a supply boat that went down in a storm nobody had been staffed to warn them about, because the warning system for that stretch of coast had been quietly decommissioned years earlier to save money. He remembered, more than the grief, the specific shape of the anger that followed it. Not anger at the storm. Storms did not choose who lived and who drowned. His anger was for the meetings that happened afterward, the calm voices explaining that the warning system's removal had been the responsible choice, given limited resources and competing priorities. He had been too young to understand economics. He had understood, perfectly, what it felt like to be told that his sister's life had been weighed against a budget line and found wanting. Humanity had rebuilt slowly after the reclamation, and the world that emerged from those hard years carried a scar that never fully closed. Nations that had once hoarded resources learned, at terrible cost, that hoarding only delayed the reckoning. A new generation grew up hearing the stories, the towns lost to indifference, the warnings ignored, the help that came only after it was too late to matter. That generation built a different kind of civilization, one that still argued and still made mistakes, but that carried inside it a stubborn, half-superstitious belief. When someone asks for help and you can give it, and you sort out the cost later. It was that belief, more than any strategic calculation, that had put 12 human warships in orbit around a colony belonging to a species Earth had known for less than a year. Reyes was not alone in carrying that history onto the battlefield. Lieutenant Priya Iyer, standing at the tactical station beside him, had grown up on stories her grandmother told about a flooded village and a government that decided helping wasn't worth the money. Dr. Elias Grant had lost an uncle during the early famine years, when international food shipments had been delayed by trade negotiations, while people starved waiting for the paperwork to clear. Even Naomi Cho, calm and diplomatic as she seemed, carried her own private ledger of names she had grown up hearing, people who had needed help that arrived too late or not at all. This was the quiet, unspoken engine that powered the human relief convoy, not orders from a government, not profit. A generation-deep refusal to be, ever again, the ones who looked away. Sensor contact confirmed, the tactical officer said, breaking the silence on the bridge. Marrow Swarm formation approaching Colony 7's outer defense perimeter. Estimated swarm units, 400 and counting. Veltar defense fleet is down to 11 vessels and falling back toward the planet. 400 against 11, Reyes said quietly. And they're still fighting. They don't have anywhere else to fall back to, sir, Ayer said. Reyes straightened. Then neither do we. All ships. This is Reyes. Formation Bravo. Converge on Colony 7's perimeter. Dr. Grant, how close is the signal disruptor? Functional, but untested, Grant said from the science station, sweat visible on his brow despite the ship's climate control. I can activate it on your mark, but I don't know exactly what it'll do to a live swarm formation. It could disrupt their coordination. It could do nothing at all. Then we'll find out together, Reyes said. Helm, take us in. Weapons, randomize firing sequences per the drill patterns we practiced. I want no two ships firing the same pattern twice in a row. The Resolute and its 11 sister ships dropped out of their approach vector and into the chaos surrounding Colony 7, and for the first time, the crew of the human relief convoy saw the Marrow Swarm with their own eyes instead of through Veltar recordings. It did not look like a fleet. It looked like a living storm. Thousands of small biological vessels moving in patterns that seemed random until you watched long enough to see the terrible order underneath. Individual units sacrificing themselves to open paths for others. Damaged units retreating, not to save themselves, but to carry information back to the greater mass. Engaging, Reyes said, and the Resolute's weapons opened fire. The first exchange went almost exactly as the simulations predicted. Human weapons, powerful but unfamiliar to the swarm, tore through the first wave of attacking units with brutal efficiency. For nearly 6 minutes, the human convoy carved a path through the outer edge of the swarm formation, and aboard the Veltar defense fleet, exhausted crews who had been fighting without relief for days watched something they had almost stopped believing could exist. Reinforcements that had actually arrived. Then, exactly as Grant had feared, the swarm began to adapt. Enemy units shifting attack vectors, the tactical officer reported, urgency creeping into his voice. They're avoiding our primary weapon arcs. Formation Bravo taking hits on secondary hull sections. They've mapped our firing patterns already, Grant said, staring at the sensor readout in disbelief. 6 minutes. It took them 6 minutes to start adjusting. Then we adjust faster, Reyes said. Dr. Grant, activate the disruptor. Now. Grant's hands moved across the science station controls, and a moment later, a narrow band of tight beam radiation swept out from the Resolute's forward emitters, invisible to the naked eye, but immediately visible on every sensor screen aboard the human ships, as the swarm formation directly ahead of them faltered. For nearly 30 seconds, the coordinated movement of several dozen swarm units broke apart into confused, uncoordinated drifting, easy targets for the Resolute's weapons and for the ships flanking her. It's working, Ayer said, disbelief and hope warring in her voice. Only on units in direct line of the beam, Grant warned. It's not a fleet-wide solution, and I don't know how long before the rest of the swarm adapts to the frequency. Then we use it while we have it, Reyes said. Concentrate fire on disrupted units. Clear a path toward the Veltar fleet. We're pulling their wounded out first. The battle that followed was neither clean nor easy. 2 human ships took heavy damage pulling Veltar survivors free from the collapsing perimeter. A third, the light cruiser Meridian, lost half its crew when a wave of swarm units that had already adapted past the disruptor frequency broke through its shields in a coordinated ramming attack that no simulation had predicted. But by the time the swarm, having taken heavier losses than any previous encounter with the Veltar, pulled back to regroup at a distance, the human convoy and the surviving Veltar defense fleet still held Colony 7's orbital space. It was not a victory. Not yet. But it was the first time in the entire war that the Marrow Swarm had been forced to retreat. Aboard the Resolute, Reyes stood in the aftermath, listening to damage reports come in from across the fleet. 31 dead, dozens more wounded, 2 ships critically damaged. It was a heavier cost than he had hoped for, heavier than the Concordium would ever have accepted as a reasonable price for a single border colony. Was it worth it? Ayer asked quietly, watching the same damage reports scroll past. Reyes thought of a flooded coastline, of a sister he had never stopped missing, of a council chamber full of powerful people who had calculated an entire planet not worth saving. "Ask the people still alive down there," he said. "Ask them tomorrow, and the day after, and every day the swarm doesn't come back and finish what it started. That's the only answer that's ever mattered to me." Behind them, on the long-range sensors, the Marrow Swarm continued its retreat, regrouping, adapting, learning from its first true defeat, and preparing, though no one aboard the human fleet yet knew it, for something far larger than a single skirmish over a single colony. In the chaos of the retreat, as the swarm pulled back to regroup at a distance, Corporal Osei found himself working, without pause, in the Resolute's medical bay, treating wounded crew pulled from the damaged sections of the ship. He had expected, in the abstract, to understand what real combat looked like. He found the reality far harder than anything his training had prepared him for, and yet he did not stop, moving from one wounded crew member to the next, steadying his hands each time, by remembering Vega's words from before the battle began. Aboard the Veltar flagship, Fleet Commander Ashel watched the human ships fight with an expression his own crew had rarely seen on him before, something between disbelief and quiet gratitude. He had led the Veltar defense fleet through every engagement since the Marrow Swarm first appeared, watching his own ships and crews worn down battle after battle, with no reinforcement in sight. He had begun to believe, in the weeks before the humans arrived, that his fleet's final duty would simply be to die slowly, buying what little time they could for evacuations that had nowhere left to go. "They are not what I expected," Ashal said quietly to his second-in-command, watching the human ships hold their position, even as damage reports mounted around them. "No, Commander," his second agreed. "Neither is what they have done today." When the battle finally ended and the swarm withdrew, Ashal requested a direct channel to Commander Reyes, something he had not done during the fighting itself, when every available line of communication had been needed for coordination. "Commander Reyes," Ashal said, when the channel connected, "on behalf of the Veltar defense fleet, and on behalf of every person still alive on that colony below us, I offer you my gratitude, and my apology." "Apology for what?" Reyes asked. "For doubting, even briefly, that a species so young to the wider galaxy could stand against something that has already destroyed 3 of our worlds," Ashal said. "I will not make that mistake again." "You don't owe us an apology, Commander," Reyes said. "You've been fighting this thing alone for months, with nothing but your own courage to rely on. We just showed up late." "You showed up," Ashal said simply. "That is more than anyone else in this galaxy was willing to do." News of the battle over Colony 7 reached the Concordium within a day, carried by the same observation networks that tracked every significant engagement in known space. What arrived in the Great Hall was not a clean victory report. It was a mess of numbers: 31 human dead, 2 ships critically damaged, 1 ship destroyed outright, against a swarm force that had lost hundreds of units but remained, by any honest measure, still overwhelmingly larger than anything defending Veltar space. The Threll admiral who had dismissed the human mission as theater read the report twice before setting it down. "They held the line," he said, and there was no amusement left in his voice. "They held it at a cost the Ascendancy would never authorize," said another officer beside him. 31 dead, defending a single colony that our own analysts rated as strategically worthless. "And yet, it is still there," the admiral said. "The colony, it is still there." Across the chamber, delegates who had voted unanimously to refuse the Veltar now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of explaining, to their own governments and to increasingly curious media networks, why a young species with barely a decade of interstellar experience had accomplished in one battle what the Concordium's own calculations had declared impossible without unacceptable losses. The Ophidian priest who had once spoken of the great pattern pruning the weak, requested and received a private viewing of the full sensor logs from the battle. She watched, in silence, as the human ships absorbed damage that any Ophidian war barge would have retreated from within the first minute, and kept fighting anyway, not out of some tactical advantage, but out of what looked, to her ancient and pattern-trained eyes, disturbingly like simple refusal to stop. She said nothing about it in the council chamber, but that night, alone in her private quarters, she opened an old data archive containing records of her own species' early history, a time long before the Ophidian Curia existed, when her ancestors had also been small and desperate, and refused by everyone stronger than themselves. She had not looked at those records in centuries. She looked at them for a long time that night. Meanwhile, in the Outer Rim, word of the battle spread far faster and far more personally than any official Concordium report could travel. Among the minor species who had learned, over generations, to expect nothing from the great powers, the story of the human relief convoy took on a shape closer to legend than to military history. A trading vessel captain from a struggling species called the Dorith, whose homeworld had survived a resource crisis only through black market smuggling because the Concordium deemed formal aid too costly, heard the story secondhand from a Veltar refugee and immediately altered his trade route to pass through human space, hoping to learn more. They fought a fleet 100 times their size, the refugee told him, for a species they had known less than a year, and they did not ask what it would cost them first. The captain did not entirely believe the story. He had heard too many stories in his life that turned out to be exaggerated by fear and hope in equal measure, but he remembered it and filed it away, the way the Ithrel delegate in the Concordium had filed away his own quiet note, "Watch what the humans do next." Back in Veltar space, the human relief convoy spent 3 days making emergency repairs in orbit around Colony 7, working alongside Veltar engineers who had never seen human technology before, and found themselves alternately impressed by its bluntness and baffled by how little of it seemed designed for elegance. Commander Reyes used the lull to walk the wounded decks personally, something few captains bothered to do, checking on injured crew and speaking with the medical staff working to keep the critically wounded stable until they could be transported home. He found Dr. Grant in the science bay, running the same sensor data from the battle over and over, searching for patterns. "You should be resting," Reyes said. "So should you," Grant said, not looking up. "The disruptor bought us 30 seconds before the swarm adapted to the frequency. Next time it might buy us 15, or 5. It's already learning around what we did. Then we need something new for next time." "I know," Grant said. "I'm working on it. But Commander, there's something else in this data that worries me more than the adaptation rate." Reyes pulled up a chair. "Tell me." "The swarm units we destroyed weren't just dying," Grant said, pulling up a series of biological scans on the science bay's main display. "Look here. In the final moments before destruction, several units released a burst of biological signal, a transmission, back toward the main swarm mass. I think they weren't just retreating when they pulled back. I think they were reporting. Everything we did in that battle, our weapon patterns, the disruptor frequency, even the way our ships maneuvered, all of it may already be part of the swarm's collective memory. So the next fight will be harder. The next fight will assume we already used our best tricks," Grant said. "Whatever we try next needs to be something the swarm has genuinely never seen. Not a variation, something new." Reyes considered this in silence for a long moment. "What about the Veltar themselves? Their own defense fleet has been fighting this thing for months. Do they have anything in their arsenal we haven't seen yet?" "Ambassador Tuven mentioned something earlier," Naomi Cho said, entering the science bay in time to catch the tail end of the conversation. "An old planetary defense weapon, something the Veltar built generations ago during an internal conflict, before they achieved unity as a people. It was never meant for space combat. It's a ground-based energy cannon, powerful enough to be considered a weapon of last resort, even among their own history. They stopped maintaining it decades ago once the wars ended." "Would it still function?" Reyes asked. "Tuven doesn't know," Naomi said, "but he's willing to find out, if it means keeping the swarm away from the capital." "Then let's find out together," Reyes said, standing. "Dr. Grant, I want you and a Veltar engineering team down on the surface within the day, looking at that weapon. If it can be adapted to work alongside our own tactics, it might be exactly the kind of surprise the swarm hasn't accounted for." "And if it can't be adapted?" Grant asked. "Then we'll find something else," Reyes said. "We didn't come this far to run out of ideas, the first time something got difficult." As the human and Veltar teams began the work of preparing for whatever the swarm would attempt next, word continued to spread outward through the galaxy, carried by traders, refugees, and quiet diplomatic channels alike. In the Great Hall of the Concordium, the powers who had refused to help found themselves facing a slower, subtler consequence than any battle could inflict: The growing, uncomfortable awareness among their own citizens that somewhere out on the rim, a species barely a decade into galactic society, had chosen to bleed for strangers, while their own governments had chosen calculation instead. It was not yet a crisis of leadership, but it was, for the first time in a very long while, a crack in the quiet confidence of the great powers. And cracks, as every engineer aboard the human relief convoy could have told them, had a way of spreading when nobody addressed them in time. Down on the surface of Colony 7, in the makeshift shelters where civilians had spent the battle waiting to learn whether their world would still exist by morning, a Veltar farmer named Doss emerged into daylight to find human repair crews already working alongside Veltar engineers to restore the colony's damaged power grid. He had lost his brother in the fighting 3 months earlier, during the swarm's first assault on the outer settlements, and he had come to believe, in the months since, that no help was coming, and none ever would. He approached one of the human engineers, a young woman named Specialist Reyes, who was elbow-deep in a damaged relay station, and asked, through a translation device, why she had come so far to help people she did not know. Reyes thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Where I'm from, there's a story about a village that flooded because nobody thought it was worth the cost of saving," she said. "I grew up hearing that story, and I always wondered what kind of person you'd have to be to let that happen when you could have stopped it. I guess I decided a long time ago I didn't want to be that kind of person." Doss did not fully understand the reference, but he understood the feeling behind it well enough. "My brother died believing help would never come," he said quietly. "I'm sorry," Reyes said, and meant it. "We can't bring him back, but we can make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else here, as long as we're able to stop it." Word of small exchanges like this one spread through the colony almost as quickly as news of the battle itself, and in the days that followed, Veltar civilians began, cautiously at first, to treat the human relief workers not as strange, obligated outsiders, but as something closer to allies who had chosen, freely, to stand beside them. It was a small thing, in the shadow of a war still far from over, but it was the first thread of a bond that would, in time, grow into something neither species had expected when the crisis began. That evening, Ambassador Tuven walked among the repair crews himself, watching humans and Veltar work side by side under the same floodlights, and thought, not for the first time, that the Concordium's Grand Hall had never once looked anything like this. The old Veltar defense cannon sat at the center of a ruined fortress on the edge of the capital's farmland, half buried in decades of overgrown vines and forgotten history. Dr. Elias Grant stood at its base, looking up at a weapon 3 times the height of any human structure he had worked on, while a team of Veltar engineers argued quietly among themselves in their own language about whether waking the thing up was wise or foolish. "It was built during the Unity Wars," Ambassador Tuven explained, standing beside Grant as the engineers worked. "Before my people were one nation, before we learned better ways to settle our disagreements. It was designed to level cities. We stopped maintaining it the moment the wars ended, out of shame more than anything else." "Shame won't stop the swarm," Grant said. "No," Tuven agreed quietly, "but I understand now why my ancestors wanted to forget this thing existed." It took 2 full days of work, combining Veltar engineering knowledge with human power systems and Grant's own understanding of the swarm's biological weaknesses, to bring the old cannon back to functioning condition. What emerged was not the crude city killer it had once been, but something new, a focused energy weapon capable of delivering a single, massive discharge tuned specifically to the biological frequency the swarm used for internal coordination, the same frequency Grant's smaller disruptor had exploited in the battle over Colony 7, but scaled up to a force that could, in theory, disrupt an entire swarm formation at once, rather than a narrow beam's worth. "In theory," Grant reminded Commander Reyes when the two spoke over a secure channel from the surface. "We've never tested this at scale. It might work exactly as intended. It might do nothing. It might do something we haven't predicted at all." "What's your confidence level?" Reyes asked. "Honestly, Commander, 50% it disrupts the swarm significantly. 30% it does something, but not enough to matter. 20% it fails outright or damages itself trying. And the swarm's next attack? Our latest projections put it 3 days out," Grant said. "Bigger than anything we've faced, the swarm has been gathering everything it destroyed from the outer colonies into one mass, and it's heading straight for the capital. Reyes absorbed this in silence for a moment before responding. Then we use everything we have, including a 50% chance, because the alternative is facing that mass with nothing new at all. Word of the approaching attack spread quickly through Veltar space, and this time, unlike every previous crisis, there was no vote to be taken in a distant council chamber. No calculation of cost against strategic value. There was only preparation. The human relief convoy repositioned into a defensive formation around the capital, drawing on every lesson learned from the battle over Colony 7. Veltar civilian ships, coordinated by Naomi Cho and local evacuation authorities, moved as many non-essential personnel as possible into deep shelters beneath the capital, built generations earlier during the same Unity Wars that had produced the old defense cannon. Commander Reyes personally reviewed tactical plans with both human officers and the surviving Veltar fleet commanders, integrating the two forces into something resembling a single coordinated defense for the first time. "Your people fight differently than we expected," said Fleet Commander Eshel, the senior surviving Veltar officer, during one of the final planning sessions. "You do not calculate acceptable losses the way the Concordium teaches. You simply decide what needs to be protected, and you protect it, regardless of the arithmetic." "The arithmetic has its place," Reyes said, "but it's not the only thing that matters when deciding whether people are worth saving." Eshel studied him for a long moment. "The Concordium taught us, over many years of quiet rejection, that we were worth less than the cost of saving us. I confess, Commander, it will take time for my people to unlearn that lesson, even now that you are here." "Then let's give you a reason to start," Reyes said. Meanwhile, back in the Great Hall of the Concordium, word of the approaching final assault reached the Council in the form of an unusually detailed observation report, one that included, this time, a formal request from the Veltar government asking whether the Concordium wished to reconsider its earlier ruling in light of new circumstances. The Council convened again, this time with far more attention paid by outside observers than the original vote had received. Media drones from a dozen minor species hovered outside the chamber's public gallery, drawn by growing public interest in the story of the human relief effort. The Threll Admiral who had once dismissed the mission as theater found himself facing questions from his own government about why Earth had succeeded where ascendancy analysts had predicted failure. "The situation has not fundamentally changed," the Admiral argued before the Council, though with noticeably less certainty than before. "One successful skirmish does not guarantee victory against a swarm formation of this size. The costs remain unacceptably high by any reasonable calculation." "And yet the humans continue to bear those costs willingly," said a delegate from a smaller species near the back of the chamber, one who had rarely spoken in previous sessions. "Perhaps, Honored Council, our calculations have simply never included the value of keeping a promise." The vote, when it came, was closer than the first had been, though it still failed to produce a majority in favor of formal Concordium intervention. The great powers were not yet ready to abandon their doctrine of calculated non-interference, not even in the face of a battle that had already proven their own predictions wrong. But for the first time, the vote was not unanimous, and for the first time, several delegations abstained rather than voting outright against sending aid, a small crack, but a crack nonetheless, in a wall that had stood unquestioned for generations. Back in Veltar space, none of this mattered to the people preparing for the coming battle. Commander Reyes stood on the Resolute's bridge in the final hours before the swarm's projected arrival, watching final preparations complete across the human and Veltar fleets, the ancient defense cannon primed and waiting on the surface below. "All positions report ready, Commander," Lieutenant Ayer said. "Then we wait," Reyes said quietly, watching the stars for the first signs of an enemy larger than anything humanity had ever faced, fighting for a world that, a month earlier, the galaxy's greatest powers had calculated was not worth the cost of saving. He found, standing there in that quiet moment before the storm, that he did not regret the choice at all. While the engineers worked to restore the old cannon, Naomi Cho spent her days coordinating with local Veltar authorities to prepare the capital's civilian population for whatever the coming battle would bring. She met, during those preparations, a school teacher named Yeva, who had insisted on keeping her classroom open, even as evacuation orders spread through the city, believing that some sense of normal routine would help her students face the uncertainty ahead. Should I be telling them to be afraid? Yeva asked Naomi one afternoon, watching her students practice emergency shelter drills with the same seriousness they usually reserved for lessons about their people's history. Or should I be telling them everything will be fine? Tell them the truth, Naomi said. Tell them there are people, human and Veltar both, working as hard as they possibly can to make sure they get to grow up. That's not a promise of safety. But it's not a lie either. Yeva nodded slowly. My grandmother used to say that hope without truth is just a prettier kind of lie. I think I understand what she meant now. So do I, Naomi said, more than I did a year ago. That night, as Dr. Grant finished the final calibrations on the old defense cannon, Commander Reyes walked the length of the human fleet one final time before the projected battle, speaking briefly with as many crew members as he could reach, not to inspire them with grand speeches, but simply to be present, to let them see that their commander was not asking anything of them he was not equally prepared to risk himself. He found Corporal Osei in the medical bay, quietly organizing supplies for what both of them understood would likely be the worst day either had yet faced. You holding up, Corporal? Reyes asked. Trying to, sir, Osei said. Chief Vega says the odds aren't the whole story. I'm choosing to believe her. Smart woman, Reyes said. Believe her. And Corporal, whatever happens out there tomorrow, you've already done more good in this system than most people manage in a lifetime. Remember that, no matter how the day goes. Osei nodded, steadying himself, and went back to preparing for whatever the morning would bring. Fleet Commander Ashel spent that same final night reviewing battle plans with his own surviving officers, aware, though he said nothing of it aloud, that the coming fight would likely ask more of his people than any battle before it. He thought of his crew, of the colonies already lost, and of the strange, stubborn allies who had crossed the stars to stand beside his people when no one else would. Whatever the morning brought, he decided, his fleet would not be the ones who broke first. The Marrow Swarm arrived exactly on schedule, 3 days after Dr. Grant's projection, and it arrived in a shape that made even the most experienced human officers aboard the Resolute go quiet. It was no longer the scattered, storm-like formation the convoy had faced at Colony 7. It had consolidated everything, every unit gathered from 3 destroyed colonies, into a single vast mass that blotted out the stars behind it as it approached the capital world. Sensor estimates put its size at over 3,000 individual units, a number that dwarfed anything either the human or Veltar fleets could hope to match ship for ship. That's not a fleet, Lieutenant Ayer said quietly, staring at the tactical display. That's an extinction event. Then we make sure it isn't, Reyes said, though even he felt the weight of what was approaching. The defense plan Reyes and Fleet Commander Ashal had built together relied on layers, each one designed to slow the swarm and force it to spend itself before reaching the capital. The outermost layer consisted of the combined human and Veltar fleets, positioned to intercept the swarm at maximum range and inflict what damage they could, using randomized tactics designed to prevent easy adaptation. The middle layer relied on planetary defense platforms, aging Veltar orbital stations reactivated and reinforced with human technology over the preceding days. The final layer was the old defense cannon on the surface, primed to deliver its single, massive disruption pulse at the moment the swarm formation was most concentrated within range. One shot, Grant reminded Reyes over the comm, as the swarm closed the final distance. The cannon can fire once before its power core needs hours to recharge. Hours we won't have in the middle of a battle. We need the timing exact. Then we make the timing exact, Reyes said. All ships. This is Reyes. We are the wall between that thing and the capital. We are not moving unless we are ordered to fall back, and I do not intend to give that order. Fire at will, randomized patterns, protect the platforms at all costs. The battle that followed was unlike anything either species had faced before. The combined human and Veltar fleet met the swarm's leading edge at extreme range, inflicting heavy losses in the opening minutes through sheer volume of fire. But the sheer size of the incoming mass meant that for every dozen swarm units destroyed, 100 more pressed forward behind them. Within the first 20 minutes, 2 Veltar cruisers were lost, overwhelmed by a coordinated ramming maneuver that human sensors had not seen the swarm attempt before. Grant, monitoring the engagement from the Surface Command Center alongside Naomi Cho and Ambassador Tuven, watched in growing alarm as the swarm adapted its tactics in real time, exploiting weaknesses in the human and Veltar defensive formation faster than either fleet's commanders could respond. "It's learning too fast," Grant said. "Faster than at Colony 7. It must have integrated everything it observed there." "Can the disruptor buy them time?" Naomi asked. "The small disruptor might slow one wave," Grant said. "It won't be enough against something this size. We need the main cannon, and we need it fired at exactly the right moment, when the bulk of the swarm mass is concentrated close enough to the capital for the pulse to reach it, but before it reaches the planet's surface." Aboard the Resolute, Reyes watched his own tactical displays with a growing understanding that the battle plan, built on careful timing and coordination, was beginning to fray under the sheer scale of what they faced. 2 more ships, 1 human and 1 Veltar, reported critical damage within minutes of each other. The outer defense line was buckling faster than projected. "Commander," Ayer said, voice tight, "if the swarm breaks through the outer line at this rate, it reaches the orbital platforms in under 10 minutes. The cannon needs the swarm concentrated at optimal range, which means we need to hold that line at least that long." "Then we hold it," Reyes said. He opened a fleet-wide channel, his voice carrying to every human and Veltar vessel still fighting. "All ships, this is Reyes. I need 10 more minutes. I know what I'm asking. I know what it will cost. But if we fall back now, everything on that surface dies anyway, and it dies for nothing. Hold the line." Fleet Commander Aishel's voice came back over the same channel, steady despite the chaos surrounding his own flagship. "The Veltar Defense Fleet holds with you, Commander. We did not come this far to retreat now." For the next 9 minutes, the combined fleet fought at a cost that no Concordium analyst would ever have sanctioned. Ships took hits that should have forced retreat, and kept fighting anyway. Damage control teams worked through active combat to keep failing systems online just long enough to fire 1 more volley. On the Resolute itself, an explosion in the aft section killed 6 crew members and knocked out a third of the ship's weapon systems, and still Reyes refused to give the order to withdraw. "9th minute," Ayer called out, voice strained. "Swarm mass, approaching optimal concentration for the cannon." "Dr. Grant," Reyes said into the comm, "tell me you're ready." "Cannon charged and locked," Grant's voice came back, tense but steady. "Waiting on your mark, Commander." Reyes watched the tactical display, the vast, churning mass of the Marrow Swarm drawing ever closer to the concentration point Grant's calculations required, while his own fleet bled and burned to buy the seconds necessary to get it there. 10 minutes, Ayer said. "Optimal window now, Commander." Reyes took one breath, thinking of a sister lost to indifference, of a Concordium chamber full of calculations that valued nothing except themselves, of a young officer named Ayer, whose grandmother had taught her that the worst thing in the world was watching people decide you were not worth saving. "Dr. Grant," he said, "fire." In the medical bay, Corporal Osei and Chief Vega worked without pause, as the first wounded began arriving from the outer defense line, the ship shuddering periodically under the strain of nearby impacts. Osei found himself steadying his hands the same way he had before the first battle, remembering Vega's words, and his grandfather's stories, and the simple, stubborn belief that had carried him this far. "Multiple casualties incoming," Vega called out, already moving toward the bay's entrance as the first stretcher arrived. "Osei, with me." "Yes, Chief," Osei said, and did not hesitate. Above them, on the bridge, Lieutenant Ayer watched the tactical display with an intensity that left no room for fear, calling out adjustments to firing patterns as fast as she could process the shifting battle, her voice steady, even as the numbers around her grew worse by the minute. "Commander," she said, as the 9th minute approached, "the outer line is barely holding. If we lose one more ship in the next 60 seconds, the gap will be wide enough for a breakthrough before the cannon fires." "Then we don't lose one more ship," Reyes said, though he knew the decision was not entirely his to make. He opened the fleet channel one final time. "All ships, hold position. I know what I'm asking. Hold the line." Across the battlefield, human and Veltar crews alike gritted through failing systems, wounded hulls, and mounting losses, each of them holding on to whatever private reason had brought them to that moment. A lost sister, a flooded village, a brother who died believing help would never come, a grandmother's stories about the worst thing in the world. When the 10th minute finally arrived, and Grant's voice crackled over the comm confirming the cannon's readiness, Reyes felt the weight of every one of those private reasons pressing down on the single word he was about to give. "Fire," he said, and the sky above the Veltar capital turned white. In the seconds before that final order, Reyes allowed himself one last look at the tactical display, at the small, stubborn cluster of human and Veltar ships holding their ground against a force that outnumbered them many times over. Whatever happened next, he thought, no one aboard those ships had needed to be there. Every single one of them had chosen it, freely, knowing exactly what it might cost. The old Veltar cannon fired once, a pulse of energy that lit up the sky above the capital brighter than the system's own sun, tuned precisely to the biological frequency the Marrow Swarm used to coordinate itself across thousands of individual units. For a long, terrible moment, nothing on the tactical displays aboard the Resolute made sense. The pulse swept outward from the surface, in an expanding sphere, passing through the leading edge of the swarm formation, and continuing on toward the concentrated mass further back, exactly as Grant's calculations had predicted. Then, across the battlefield, the swarm began to falter. Not all at once, and not completely. But wherever the pulse reached, coordinated formations broke apart into confused, drifting clusters. Individual units suddenly cut off from whatever collective signal had guided their movements moments before. Ships that had been dodging and weaving with terrifying precision suddenly hung motionless in space, easy targets for the human and Veltar weapons that had been fighting for their lives only seconds earlier. "It worked," Ayer said, disbelief cracking through the exhaustion in her voice. "Commander, it worked." "Not everywhere," Reyes said, watching the outer edges of the swarm formation, far from the pulse's effective range, continuing their advance uninterrupted. "The disruption isn't total. Concentrate fire on the affected units. Clear as much of the confused mass as we can, before the effect wears off." For the next several minutes, the combined human and Veltar fleet tore through the disoriented heart of the swarm formation, inflicting losses that dwarfed anything achieved in the entire war up to that point. Grant, watching from the surface command center, monitored the pulse's effect degrading in real time. "Effect radius shrinking," he warned over the comm. "I estimate 2 more minutes before the affected units begin reorganizing. The cannon needs hours to recharge. We won't get another shot. Then we use every second we have left," Reyes said. The battle in those final minutes was brutal and costly on both sides, but it was no longer the one-sided catastrophe it had threatened to become. By the time the disrupted swarm units began, slowly, to reorganize and rejoin the collective signal, the human and Veltar fleet had destroyed nearly a third of the total swarm mass, a devastating blow that no previous engagement in the war had come close to matching. It was not, however, a clean victory. The remaining swarm forces, though diminished, still vastly outnumbered the defenders, and with the cannons spent and unable to fire again for hours, the defenders had lost their single greatest advantage. It was in this desperate final stretch of the battle that Fleet Commander Ashel made the decision that would be remembered, in Veltar history, for generations afterward. His flagship, the Veltar, had already sustained crippling damage during the earlier fighting, its weapons largely destroyed, its hull barely holding together under continued strain. Rather than retreat and abandon the line while the disrupted swarm units began to reorganize, Ashal ordered the Veltar's remaining engines pushed to their absolute limit and drove the dying ship directly into the heart of the reorganizing swarm mass, detonating what remained of the ship's reactor core in a final explosion that scattered and destroyed hundreds more swarm units at once. "Fleet Commander Ashal," Reyes said over the comm, watching the sensor readout in stunned silence, "confirm your status." There was a long pause before Ashal's voice returned, weaker now, but calm. "The Veltar has done what it needed to do, Commander. Tell my people the line held. Tell them we did not run." The channel went silent moments later, and the Veltar's signal did not return. The loss of Ashel and the Veltar, combined with the devastating losses already inflicted by the cannon's pulse, finally broke the swarm's ability to press its assault. What remained of the vast formation, disorganized, diminished, and no longer capable of the coordinated onslaught it had arrived with, began a slow, ragged retreat toward the outer system, harried the entire way by the surviving human and Veltar ships. By the time the last swarm units withdrew beyond effective sensor range, the capital of the Veltar homeworld remained standing, its people alive, its cities untouched by the destruction that had already claimed 3 of their colonies. The cost had been immense. Of the 12 human ships that had entered Veltar space, 4 had been destroyed, and 2 more critically damaged beyond immediate repair. Of the 11 surviving Veltar defense ships that had begun the final battle, only 6 remained. Casualty reports, when they finally came in fully, listed over 200 human and Veltar dead combined, a number far higher than any Concordium analyst would have accepted as a reasonable price for saving a single world. Commander Reyes stood on the Resolute's damaged bridge in the hours after the battle, reading through the casualty lists with the particular kind of exhaustion that comes only after surviving something that should not have been survivable. Dr. Grant found him there, looking, for the first time since the mission began, genuinely uncertain of what to say. "We held," Grant said finally. "We held," Reyes agreed, "at a cost the Concordium would call unforgivable." "Would you have made a different choice?" Grant asked. Knowing the cost in advance, Reyes thought of Ashal's final words, of a sister lost to indifference decades ago, of a council chamber that had calculated an entire world not worth saving. "No," he said, "I wouldn't change a single part of it. Some things are worth the cost, even when the cost is everything." Below them, on the surface of a world that had come within hours of extinction, the people of the Veltar capital emerged from their shelters to find their homes still standing, their families still alive, and in the skies above them, the wreckage of human and Veltar ships that had bled and burned to make sure of it. It was, everyone involved would later agree, the single most costly and most necessary battle either species had ever fought, and it marked the moment the entire galaxy finally began to understand what humanity had meant when it answered a plea for help that everyone else had refused. In the medical bay, Corporal Osei felt the ship shudder violently as the Velinar's reactor detonated somewhere beyond the hull, and for a moment believed the Resolute itself had been struck. When the damage reports came back clear, he allowed himself a single, shaking breath before returning to the wounded still waiting for treatment, understanding only later, once the battle had fully ended, exactly what that explosion had meant, and exactly what it had cost. Chief Vega, working beside him, paused only long enough to say, "That's the sound of somebody buying us time, Corporal. Don't waste it." Osei nodded and kept working. On the bridge, Lieutenant Ayer watched the swarm's retreat begin in earnest, the vast formation breaking apart and withdrawing toward the outer system, and felt something she had not expected to feel in the middle of a battle this costly, a fierce, unshakable relief that the line, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, had held. "Confirmed retreat across all sectors," she reported, voice raw with exhaustion. "The swarm is withdrawing, Commander." Reyes allowed himself a long breath before responding. "Stand down from maximum alert. Begin recovery operations for our wounded and our dead, and somebody get me a channel to the surface. I want Ambassador Tuven to hear this from us directly, not from a sensor report." When the channel connected and Reyes delivered the news that the capital had survived, he heard, even across the distance of a comlink, the sound of a species allowing itself, for the first time in months, to breathe. Later, standing among the wreckage-strewn orbit above a world that still turned beneath its sun, Reyes thought of Ashal's final transmission, of the Velinar's sacrifice, and of every name that would need to be read aloud once the full casualty count was known. It was not a clean victory. It would never feel like one. But it was, undeniably, a world still standing that would not have stood without it. In the weeks following the battle over the Veltar homeworld, the true scale of what had happened began to spread across the galaxy, no longer as a single unconfirmed report from a border system, but as verified sensor data, survivor testimony, and, most powerfully of all, the simple fact that a species the Concordium had calculated as not worth saving was still alive. The Veltar capital held a public memorial for the dead of both fleets, human and Veltar alike, gathered together in the same ceremony, rather than separate observances. Ambassador Tuven, standing before a crowd of his own people for the first time since his humiliating appearance before the Concordium Council, found himself struggling to find words equal to what had happened. "I stood before the great powers of this galaxy," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "and I was told, politely, in careful language, designed to avoid sounding cruel, that we were not worth the cost of saving. I believed, in that moment, that we would die exactly the way the Concordium expected, quietly, and without anyone outside our own system caring enough to notice. He paused, looking out at the crowd, many of whom wore the marks of recent grief, but who were, nonetheless, alive to grieve. I was wrong, Tuven continued. Not because the Concordium changed its mind. It did not. The great powers of this galaxy still believe, to this day, that saving us was not a reasonable choice. We are alive because a species none of us had ever properly met made a different choice than the one the Concordium recommended. They did not calculate whether we were worth saving. They simply decided that we were, and then they paid the cost of that decision with their own lives, alongside ours. Among the names read aloud during the memorial was Fleet Commander Ashal, whose final act had become, in the short time since the battle, the single most told story among the Veltar people, a symbol of what it meant to hold a line when everything depended on it. Commander Alex Reyes attended the ceremony in person, standing beside Naomi Cho and Dr. Grant, all three still carrying the particular weight of survivors who understood exactly how close the outcome had come to going the other way. News of the battle reached the Concordium's Great Hall in the form of an official report far more detailed than any previous update, compiled jointly by human and Veltar authorities, and submitted, deliberately, as a public record rather than a private diplomatic communication. The Threll Admiral who had once dismissed the mission as theater read the full casualty and engagement data in a council session, attended by more outside observers than any meeting in recent memory. 200 dead, the Admiral said quietly, and for once, there was no dismissal in his voice. A third of an enemy force, 3,000 strong, destroyed in a single engagement, a homeworld saved, that our own analysts calculated as unsalvageable. The math, said the Ithrel delegate, the same quiet representative who had been watching the human mission closely since its departure from Earth, did not include the cost of a promise kept, Admiral. Perhaps it should have. The Ophidian priest, who had spent long nights reviewing the sensor logs from the earlier battle at Colony 7, requested and was granted permission to address the council directly, an unusual step for a religious representative rather than a political one. I have spent my life studying the Great Pattern, she said, and I once stood in this chamber and told a desperate ambassador that his people's suffering was simply the pattern, pruning what could not grow strong enough to survive on its own. I have reviewed the full record of what happened at the Veltar homeworld, and I confess, honored council, that I no longer know what the pattern actually favors. Perhaps it favors those with the greatest fleets and the most careful calculations. Or perhaps, and I suspect this may be closer to the truth, it favors those willing to bleed for something larger than themselves. I do not know which, but I no longer believe the answer is as simple as I once claimed. The council did not, in that session or the ones that followed, formally reverse its doctrine of calculated non-interference. The great powers were not so easily moved from positions they had held for generations, but something had shifted nonetheless, a quiet, growing unwillingness among smaller and mid-tier species to accept the Concordium's calculations as the final word on who deserved help and who did not. Several minor governments, emboldened by what they had watched happen in Veltar space, began quietly reaching out to human diplomatic channels rather than waiting for Concordium approval that everyone now understood might never come. A representative of the struggling Dorith people, whose homeworld had survived only through smuggled aid years earlier, submitted a formal request for contact with Earth's government, the first of what would become, in the months ahead, a slow but steady stream of similar approaches from species who had learned to expect nothing from the powers that had always claimed to speak for the galaxy as a whole. The great powers themselves responded to this shift the way great powers often do when their authority begins to erode, not by changing their behavior, but by attempting to reshape the story around it. Within a month of the battle, both the Threll Ascendancy and the Marn Combine quietly offered the Veltar government post-crisis humanitarian assistance, reconstruction aid, trade concessions, and diplomatic support, carefully framed not as an admission of earlier failure, but as generous assistance freely given. Ambassador Tuven, addressing the Concordium Council one final time before returning permanently to his homeworld, did not bother disguising his understanding of what was actually being offered. I thank the Ascendancy and the Combine for their generous offers, he said, his tone carrying a precision that left no doubt about his meaning. I would only note, for the Council's record, that these offers arrive only now that my people have survived, thanks entirely to a species this council refused to even consider as a partner in our defense. We accept assistance freely given by anyone willing to give it honestly, but my people will remember, for a very long time, who answered when we asked for help, and who answered only after the outcome was already decided. He left the chamber without waiting for a response, and behind him, in the great hall built to make small beings feel smaller, the powers of the galaxy were left to reckon, for the first time in generations, with the uncomfortable knowledge that their calculations, however precise, had failed to account for something they had never properly measured: the cost of being the ones who said no. In the days following the memorial, Corporal Osei found himself walking through the streets of the Veltar capital during a rare period of leave, watching civilians go about the slow work of rebuilding, children playing in courtyards that had nearly been reduced to rubble weeks earlier. A young Veltar girl approached him shyly, having apparently been told by her parents that the humans had helped save their city, and asked, through halting use of a translation device, why he had come so far to help people he had never met. Osei thought of Vega's words before the battle, of his grandfather's stories about the flood, and of everything that had happened since. Someone asked for help, he said simply, and we were able to give it. Where I come from, we try not to let that be a hard question. The girl seemed to consider this seriously, in the manner of children who take adult answers more literally than adults expect. I hope my people can be like that too someday, she said. I think you already are, Osei said. You're still here. Word of small moments like this one spread quietly through both the Veltar capital and the wider Concordium, carried not through official reports, but through the countless individual stories of civilians who had lived through the battle and its aftermath. Together, these small stories did more to shift public opinion across the galaxy than any formal diplomatic statement could have managed, humanizing, in a way statistics never could, exactly what had been risked and exactly what had been saved. Even within the Concordium itself, the shift was visible in small ways. Junior clerks and aides, the same rank of official who had once quietly apologized to Tuven in a hallway outside the Great Hall, began speaking more openly among themselves about the growing gap between what the great powers claimed to value and what they actually chose to protect. It would take far longer than a single battle to change the deep structures of galactic politics. But the first cracks, once formed, rarely closed on their own. Ambassador Tuven carried these small stories with him when he addressed the council one final time, understanding that they, more than any casualty report or battle statistic, told the truth of what had happened in his system and what it had cost the people willing to answer for it. A year after the battle over the Veltar homeworld, Commander Alex Reyes stood once again on the observation deck of a ship in Earth orbit, though this time the view before him looked very different from the 12 battered vessels that had first departed for a system nobody else had been willing to defend. Where there had once been a single relief convoy, assembled in a hurry, and sent out with little more than hope and stubbornness, there was now a growing fleet, still small by the standards of the great powers, but larger and better prepared than the one that had first answered the Veltar's plea. Some of the new ships bore Veltar design elements alongside human engineering, the product of a formal alliance signed between Earth and the Veltar government within months of the battle's end. An alliance built not on trade advantage or strategic calculation, but on the plain fact that the two peoples had already bled together once and had chosen, deliberately, to continue standing together. Ambassador Tuven, no longer representing a desperate petitioner but a formally recognized ally of Earth, had become a frequent visitor to human space in the year since the battle. He found Reyes on the observation deck that day, watching the assembled fleet with the same quiet attention he had shown before every mission since the war began. "You look like a man thinking about the past," Tuven said, joining him at the viewport. "I'm thinking about the future, actually," Reyes said. "We've had 11 formal requests for assistance in the last 6 months alone. Species we'd never even heard of a year ago, reaching out because they've heard the story of what happened at your homeworld and decided we're worth asking." "And will Earth answer all of them?" Tuven asked. "We can't," Reyes admitted. "We don't have the fleet or the resources to answer every call for help in this galaxy. That's the hard truth nobody likes talking about after a story like ours gets told. We're not the Concordium. We can't be everywhere." But you will keep answering the ones you can, Tuven said. It was not quite a question. We will, Reyes said. Not because it's easy, and not because it's always the safe choice, because somewhere along the way, we decided that the alternative, becoming the kind of people who calculate whether strangers are worth saving, was worse than the risk of losing people we cared about while trying to help. Naomi Cho, now serving as Earth's senior diplomatic envoy for what had quietly become known across human space as the Outreach Program, found the two of them still standing at the viewport when she arrived with the latest reports from the growing list of species seeking contact with Earth. The Ithrel delegation formally requested a meeting this morning, she said, joining them. Apparently, their government has been watching us for over a year now, ever since the battle. They want to know if Earth would consider a formal alliance, similar to the one we signed with the Veltar. What do you think? Reyes asked. I think, Naomi said, that we're becoming something the Concordium never expected when they voted unanimously to turn away a small, desperate ambassador a year ago. We're becoming the place species go when the great powers decide they aren't worth the cost of saving. Dr. Elias Grant, who had spent the year since the battle developing new countermeasures against swarm-like threats, based on everything learned from the Veltar engagement, joined the small gathering with a datapad full of the latest research updates. The Marrow Swarm hasn't been seen in this sector since the battle, he reported. Whatever remained of it retreated deep into unclaimed space. Doesn't mean it's gone for good. Things like that rarely are. But for now, the Veltar homeworld is safe, and we've learned enough about fighting it that we won't be starting from nothing if it ever returns. Reyes looked out at the assembled fleet one more time, thinking of everything that had brought them to this moment. A flooded coastline decades ago, a sister lost to indifference, a desperate ambassador standing in a hall built to make small beings feel small, and a single question asked by a tired diplomat in a plain room far below the grandeur of the Concordium's great chamber. How many ships do you need, and how fast can we load them? It had not been the calculated, careful decision the great powers of the galaxy would have made. It had been costly, messy, and far more dangerous than any reasonable analysis would have recommended. 200 people had died making sure of it, including a Veltar fleet commander whose final act of sacrifice was now taught to children on a world that would not exist without it. But the Veltar homeworld still turned beneath its sun. Its cities still stood. Its people still lived, grew crops, raised children, and told stories about the year the galaxy turned away, and a handful of strangers answered with fire instead of calculations. 11 new requests, Reyes said finally, turning back to the others. Let's see how many of them we can actually help. And the ones we can't? Grant asked. We tell them the truth, Reyes said, that we're not big enough to save everyone, that we'll try anyway, wherever we can, and that unlike some people in this galaxy, we'll never pretend a closed door was the only reasonable choice available. Behind them, the fleet continued its slow assembly in Earth's orbit, ships built by a species barely a decade into the wider galaxy, still too small by the old measurements to matter, and yet, somehow, already becoming the place a growing number of desperate worlds had learned to turn to first. The great powers of the galaxy had spent generations building a system designed to calculate, carefully and without emotion, which lives were worth the cost of saving. Humanity had answered that system, not with a better calculation, but with a simple, stubborn refusal to accept that any life could ever truly be counted as not worth trying to save. It was not a perfect answer. It never would be. But it was, for the first time in a very long while, an answer the galaxy could not simply file away and forget. And for the growing number of small, desperate worlds watching from the outer rim, it was, at last, a door that did not close. Corporal Osei, now a full year into his service and no longer the nervous young medic who had boarded the Resolute, uncertain of what lay ahead, had chosen to remain with the fleet, rather than return to a quieter posting back on Earth. He found Chief Vega on the observation deck that same day, watching the assembled ships with the particular satisfaction of someone who had helped build something worth building. Still think the odds aren't the whole story? Osei asked her. Still do, Vega said. But I'll admit, the odds are looking a little better these days. They're looking better because people decided to make them better, Osei said. That's what my grandfather always used to say. Odds don't fix themselves. People fix them. Smart man, Vega said. echoing the words Reyes had said to Ose a year earlier, though she had no way of knowing it. Down on the surface of the Veltar homeworld, the young girl who had once asked Ose why humans had come so far to help strangers was now old enough to help maintain the small memorial garden planted near the capital, in honor of the battle's dead, both human and Veltar names carved together on the same simple stone. She tended it without being asked, the way children sometimes carry forward the lessons adults hope, quietly, that they will remember. Ambassador Tuven visited that garden often in the years that followed, and he made a point, each time, of bringing any new Veltar official or visiting dignitary to see it before showing them anything else his world had to offer, because he believed, more strongly than he believed almost anything else, that his people should never forget exactly what it had cost to still be standing, and exactly who had chosen to stand beside them when the rest of the galaxy chose to look away. The story of that year, the plea refused by the great powers and answered instead by a small, stubborn species, barely a decade into the wider galaxy, spread slowly outward across known space, told and retold by traders, refugees, and quiet diplomatic channels alike, until it became something closer to legend than history, in the systems that had never been visited by either humans or Veltar. Not every version of the story was accurate. Some grew larger in the telling, some smaller. But the core of it remained the same in every version that mattered. When the galaxy turned away, humanity answered, and it answered with everything it had.